you. Thanks everyone for being here. I think I'm the only person in the room permitted to not have a mask on. I'm very happy to be here. Of course, I've been in Majors and Quinn many, many times and have bought at least 100, or probably hundreds of books here over the last few decades. But I'm happy to be, this is my first time on this side of the microphone, and I do want to sort of take an opportunity. I see one book dealer in the room, Kristen, and you know, my weird background being a classics professor and that sort of thing, my education in poetry came mostly from bookstores. And when I think about that, there were two bookstores that have meant the most to me. One was The Hungry Mind in St. Paul with David Yanowski, who then worked here at Majors and Quinn for a while, and the other was the Book House in Dinkytown. And I learned so much just poring over the shelves time and time again, and that's so I didn't have to go to college to learn this stuff. In any case, thank you all. So the first thing I want to do is talk a little bit about where the title comes from and give a short answer to the question, where did the title come from? The image on the cover of the book, of course, is Odin on his horse, and it's Odin with a spear and a couple of ravens flying around him and so on, and he's got a shield and a helmet and a spear. He's obvious out for, he's looking belligerent and out for a war. And so I only discovered a few years ago that this image actually comes from a helmet that I think Bly must have seen in a museum in Norway in the mid-50s, and then liked it so much, and then when he came back and started the magazine and decided to use the image. And then it happened that several years later, after William Duffy and Robert Bly started their magazine in Pine Island, Minnesota, several years later, they moved to the western part over near South Dakota to Madison, and Robert had recently remodeled a chicken coop as his study, and he decided that the new address of the magazine couldn't be RFD, Rural Free Delivery. That wouldn't look official enough, so he decided to call it Odin House. And so the new address of the magazine was Odin House in Madison, Minnesota. And so I sort of adopted this as a title born under the sign of Odin. I thought it was clever, but maybe not so much. There's a much longer answer to why I chose that title too, but this was just a short one, believe it or not. The first thing I'm going to do is read from the introduction, and I apologize in advance about the introduction. What I'm trying to do is set up the context, really the background for this phenomenon of little magazines. I imagine that most of you in this room have never read a book about a little magazine, or might not have even thought about them and what exactly they are. And so I'm trying to set up that context from the 1950s. By looking at this crowd, I can tell when I start talking about the 1950s and the 1960s, most of you will understand what I'm talking about. And that's a relief to me as well. But in any case, it was in February of 1958 that a half-page advertisement appeared in the issue of Poetry magazine, which had been around since 1912 at the time. And it announced a new literary quarterly, the 50s, a magazine of poetry and general opinion, and invited contributions and subscriptions. In retrospect, the notice seems innocuous and sober, but at the time it surely caused some puzzlement. What kind of name was the 50s, especially near the end of the decade? What was general opinion doing next to poetry? Had anyone ever heard of the editors, William Duffy and Robert Bly? Were they professors or beatniks? Did they have some hidden institutional support or inherited wealth? The address Briarwood Hill, concocted for the occasion, had an old world ring, but the town where Duffy lived, Pine Island, was unheard of. As for Minnesota, wasn't that near Chicago? Something unusual was afoot. William Duffy happens to be here tonight as well. But to put this magazine in the 50s in proper context, to appreciate fully how it fit or didn't fit there, some broad observations are in order. In the late 1950s, the so-called New York intellectuals were ascendant. Men such as Lionel Trilling and Jacques Barzun valued seriousness in literature specifically and in culture more generally, high or highbrow culture, that is. They were determined to hold the line against any reduction of standards, destruction of values, dilution of taste, in short, against Philistinism. Also, new criticism, and new criticism is in capital letters, which had taken hold in the literary world of the 1930s and 40s, was still firmly in place. Poet critics like Robert Penn Warren, John Crow Ransom, and Alan Tate placed a high value on anonymity, self-sufficiency, and aesthetic distance in a literary work. They felt that the social, historical, and political settings of a literary composition were secondary concerns, if not entirely irrelevant. So too the writer's biography. Instead, they focused their attention on technique, attaching great importance to form, rhyme, meter, and other aspects of language, as well as to mythological allusions, irony, ambiguity, paradox, and other more or less semantic complexities. More than a few young writers of the time found this program stifling and oppressive, considering a retreat from the modernist advances of the 1910s and 20s. The growing unrest became a literary revolution in the later 1950s as the opacity and formalism of new criticism was rejected in favor of a renewed interest in the radicalism and experimentation of Ezra Pound, William Carlos Williams, and other modernist figures. Emerging avant-garde schools, including the Beat poets and the Black Mountain poets, although certainly disparate, nevertheless had a common foe, and in that sense at least a common cause. More generally, this literary ferment, with its emphasis on freeing poetic language from academic restraints while also broadening poetry's responsibilities, played a significant role in the more widespread social and cultural upheaval of the 1960s. Where does a literary magazine fit into this picture? Partisan Review, the Kenyon Review, the Southern Review, the Sewanee Review, and others were the organs for the reigning literary muckety-mucks and their ilk. Sometimes called the Bigs or the Big Littles, these magazines were usually well established, had solid financial backing, and were destined for longevity. The so-called little magazines, on the other hand, were typically small, independent concerns with limited circulation and uncertain, though usually short, lifespans. Produced on a shoestring with scant or no hope of making money, they were not subject to the same constraints of propriety, conformity, and predictability as the established giants. Therefore, little mags usually were idiosyncratic, experimental, impatient, and antagonistic. The same may be said for their editors. To start such a publication requires audacity in any literary climate, for sure, along with a fervent conviction that literature is worth promoting, discussing, and criticizing. The editor's challenge lies in balancing the magazine's positive function of promoting new and original work outside the mainstream against its negative function of fostering discontent with the status quo. Some sort of manifesto or call to action is usually at least implicit in any such endeavor. Early in the 20th century, little magazines had served as the vanguard of modernism. Ezra Pound was the prototype of the little mag editor. His early cultural complaints were various and extreme, but almost uniformly against the going norm, whatever the norm was. Pound wanted to save the world. He wrote to Harriet Monroe. Harriet Monroe was the woman who had founded Poetry magazine back in 1912. He said, "My problem is to keep alive a certain group of advancing poets, to set the arts in their rightful place as the acknowledged guide and lamp of civilization." Poems in a little magazine, he thought, could and should teach and enlighten not a large general audience of readers, but a discrete audience of poets and writers. They in turn would disseminate and carry out the purposes of the ideas set forth. The Academy was not to play a role. Pound said he was writing to the alumni secretary of the University of Pennsylvania, and I quote, "All the University of Pennsylvania or your goddamn college or any other goddamn American college does or will do for a man of letters is to ask him to go away without breaking the silence." Thus, it is not surprising that some American writers in the Cold War climate of the 1950s sensed that they were on the verge of something. Poet and translator Paul Blackburn, for example, writes to Bly, "This is the greatest age of transition since the Renaissance. The Western world, Western civilization is finally dead. There's a future to build. For Christ's sake, let's make it human. Let's insist on certain human values and not just piss up a hot steam pipe about how shitty everything is." To promulgate such views, new little magazines started appearing. Early on in the 50s were Origin and Black Mountain Review. Later in that decade came the 50s, followed by Eugen, Big Table, Culture, Poems from the Floating World, and Trobar, as a trickle became a torrent. As one of the more disgruntled and zealous leaders of the uprising, Bly felt a responsibility to be of service to the culture. While he plainly had a bone to pick with the establishment, he, at first in tandem with Duffy, did not want to change the world so much as to change the way American poets wrote, read, and thought about poetry. "I set myself up to be the teacher of my own generation," he says. Bly built a platform from which he could both exercise his singular gifts as a public intellectual and gadfly and have an impact on the dramas that the next decade would bring. He called for a sustained raid on modern life, and that, in retrospect, is what he helped to deliver. Together with the 60s and 70s press, the magazine's specific objections were to foster a new imagination in American poetry, to demonstrate the need for honest criticism, and with a sustained and unprecedented commitment to translation, to direct attention beyond the traditional confines of the English language to poetry from South America, Europe, China, and elsewhere. His efforts sometimes went beyond teaching and theorizing to preaching and proselytizing. He aimed to win the hearts and minds of the unenlightened, to convert them to a new way, a new aesthetic, a new poetic faith, with a concentration on the inner life, reached and expressed via images from deep within the unconscious. Alongside this inner focus, a second campaign focused on the outer world, on the need for poets to be socially and politically engaged. The magazine was tendentious, provocative, and dead serious at the same time that it was fresh, playful, and wildly irreverent. Although it came to represent a community of poets from start to finish, it reflected the comprehensive vision of one impassioned and prolific man on a mission. Through his overlapping roles as poet, translator, critic, editor, and anti-war activist, for all of which the magazine and press served as staging ground, Bly attained an eminent position from which he wielded enormous influence and had a lasting impact. He made many friends and many enemies. The rule book he played by was very much his own. His candor was astonishing. He was not afraid to attack established poets. He insulted the editors of other magazines. He brought politics into the mix. 11 issues were published between 1958 and 1972. I have devoted a chapter of this book to each one of them, also taking into account contemporaneous press publications and other relevant writings, activities, controversies, and relationships. The output may seem meager at first, less than one issue per year, but once the individual numbers are examined with their wide array of poems, translations, quotations, critical essays, reviews, satires, parodies, and comments, and Bly's personal responsibility for the contents is weighed together with his other pursuits, that output begins to look consequential indeed. I'll skip over a little bit about the press. He also started a press that produced books, and this press, as I like to say, the two literary enterprises had a symbiotic relationship. They were siblings, more like fraternal twins, conceived simultaneously, born in quick succession, raised in the same house. Throughout these years, Bly continued to live and work just outside the small farming town where he was born and raised, which is a remarkable thing, surely. Nevertheless, his voice was not quite that of a rustic crying out in the Minnesota wilderness. It bore signs of his sophisticated literary resume, which included Harvard College, New York City, the Iowa Writers' Workshop, and a Fulbright year in Norway. While Harvard and Iowa constituted extraordinary opportunities at top-notch institutions, his initial stay in New York in the early 1950s was comparatively grim and austere. Also, Norway could scarcely have matched other European locales for belles lettres and cosmopolitanism. But as will become clear, these non-academic experiences had a profound impact on his work. It is no coincidence that Bly's appearance changed dramatically over time, from the sedate, every white-collar man in 1950s America look of suit, white shirt, tie with closely cropped hair, to the madly gesticulating, serape-clad wild man with tousled hair, wearing a mask, spouting surrealist images, chanting like a shaman, and ranting like a prophet against the power structures that were undermining the health of society. Poetry had changed, as had this poet. This book gives an account of the dispatches, mostly in magazine or book form, that issued from Odin House. It is a Minnesota story, but one that had a seismic effect, felt far beyond state lines, across the United States and beyond. Some reverberations are detectable to this day. Although he was anything but insular, Bly's location in the hinterland, roughly equidistant from New York and San Francisco, worked to his advantage, both as a haven and as a launching pad. A chronological approach allows us to trace the growth of a poetic community, as well as the development and spread of Bly's ideas. As will become apparent in assembling this account, I have stitched together copious primary source materials consisting of the dispatches themselves, as well as extensive correspondence, journal entries, and related evidence. A few of the chapters consist of in-depth digressions that help to flesh out the larger story. And I will get into those digressions again in a little bit. Just end with one more paragraph. This then is the biography of a literary magazine and press out of rural Minnesota that made a difference in the world. It entails the story of a group of poets looking for and finding a literary community based on a shared passion, common pursuits, and some healthy competition. Not so incidentally, it is also one perspective on the early career and maturation of an unusually charismatic and visionary writer. Okay, I should say, talking about community, the index in this book consists only of personal names, and there are more than 450 of them. Of course, these are not people who are living, but many people with whom Bly had some kind of contact, whether it was personal contact or not, but just as a way of really showing the breadth and the depth of his involvement in the poetry world of the day, which is astonishing, surely. My plan is to get to a little bit about his biography, that is answering the question of how did he become an editor, what led up to that point in 1958 when he became an editor, but also to talk about various aspects of the magazine, including on the one hand satire and parody, which was very important to the magazine itself, criticism and the type of criticism he engaged in, and then going into some depth on his involvement in working against the Vietnam War, which is a fundamental start of this part of this story from 1965 through to 1970 anyway. So I guess I'll begin with the satire stuff, because this stuff is a little more juicy than what I've just been talking about. Satire was of central importance to Bly. Actually, when we look back in his very early writings, we can find that he had a great sense of humor as a young boy and as a high school student, surely when he was in college as well. But he loved using satire, again, because literary magazines were also darn serious all the time, and he thought that was ridiculous. It didn't need to be that way, and that satire and parody were also in themselves useful forms of criticism from which people could learn as well. So in the years when I started reading through Bly's letters, every once in a while I would run across a phrase, iambic blech pentameter. Iambic blech pentameter, with the blech in parentheses. And I kept thinking, that looks awfully familiar. And I thought, and eventually I went, hey, that's Mad Magazine, which is a magazine I loved in the early 60s. But discovered that he and Donald Hall were very, very interested in Mad Magazine, and were in the 1950s, and were reading that as well. But there were three main satirical features in the magazines that are repeated again and again. And the first is called Madame Tussauds Wax Museum, which was aimed at poets old and new, and dealing with wax figures who are apparently alive when you first see them from a distance, but then when you get up close, you discover that they are lifeless and dead, and this is the way he saw it. So in the first issue, he gave some advice to young poems in Madame Tussauds Wax Museum to avoid language without images, that is abstract language, and thus substitute classical references or four-letter words instead of using images. And he grouped together Longfellow, Allen Ginsberg, and Ivor Winters, three very different poets, but found all of them were guilty of the same crime somehow. But then in number 2, Madame Tussauds Wax Museum, I want to read from this, calls attention with some humor to the deadening effect of classical references in poems. So he quotes poems by two contemporary poets, and then it's followed by suggested resolutions for young poets. Since he wanted young poets to be reading the magazine. And these resolutions are as follows. I promise I will neither write nor read another poem on the death of Orpheus as long as I live. I promise I will never describe the sad fate of Oedipus in a poem again on pain of losing my eyes. And finally, I promise I will never capture poor Perseus and drag him into my poems, nor Aeneas, nor good Achilles, nor Telamon, nor Penelope, mainly because no one knows who Perseus is. As I write, one might object to unwarranted assumptions and conclusion jumping here, but these funny resolutions are one more means of getting across this issue's message. If American poets of the 1950s were going to save themselves and not go down with the old poetry's sinking ship, they would have to jettison their fondness for classical allusions. This Madame Tussauds continues in issues 3 and 4 and 8, all equally funny, but probably the most famous satirical feature that Bly used in the magazine is called The Order of the Blue Toad. an award for intellectual mediocrity and always directed at the literary establishment. Instead of course, of knighthood, the Order of the British Empire, it was the Order of the Blue Toad. And so he attacked people like Gilbert Hyatt in the first, then Norman Cousins. You all remember Norman Cousins as the editor of the Saturday Review. The attack goes like this. The Order of the Blue Toad is herewith awarded to Norman Cousins, editor of the Saturday Review, for putting out a boring, stupid magazine. His list of reviewers is enough to make anyone die of boredom. Why waste paper on such junk? He praises some things about the magazine's attention to Albert Schweitzer's anti-test appeal, John Chardy's blast against Anne Morrow Lindbergh, and Cousins' opposition to the Atomic Energy Commission, but he says they are insufficient, for the magazine itself bends to every wind. The consequence is, quote, that if Cousins wants to bore people to death and still get rich, he will have to accept insults. We therefore award him the Blue Toad, painted on a background of bedroom slippers, couched and rampant. The toad is riding a fast turntable and croaking scientific maxims. Bligh's good humor and fanatic heart sometimes hit their mark to good effect. He wrote to his friend Donald Hall, Norman Cousins wrote an insane letter saying that he agreed with us and was going to try to make the Saturday Review better. So sometimes this had an effect. And then there is one more Order of the Blue Toad, which I really must read. And this is, some of you, again, who were studying poetry back in the day, remember a book called Understanding Poetry by Robert Penn Warren and Cleanth Brooks. It was sort of the standard textbook in colleges and universities. And Bly decided to award them the Blue Toad. And I'll read not all of it, but part of it here in issue number 5. The Order of the Blue Toad is awarded to Robert Penn Warren and Cleanth Brooks for their book Understanding Poetry. Now you all, a lot of you again, I'm feeling safe, remember the TV show Dragnet.
Yeah.
Yeah? This book was really written by Joe Friday. When discussing poems, if a poet shows any sign of generous feeling or whimsy, the authors say in a flat voice, "We just want the facts, ma'am." They want to know the meter, the authorized symbols, and the rhyme scheme. Of course, poets like A.E. Housman are preferred. The 5th edition in 1958, for example, has 8 poems by A.E. Housman and not a single poem by Whitman. Obviously, if Whitman wrote poetry, it cannot be understood. The book includes, moreover, no French, Spanish, German, or Chinese poems. The book should have been called Understanding A.E. Housman. And then I skip a paragraph and we get to the end. It is sad to think that this absurd book is used in almost every American university. To encourage another man to write a better book, the authors are awarded the Order of the Blue Toad. The toad, wearing A.E. Housman's mustache, is painted on a scarlet background. It is turning a meter machine with its left foot and correcting term papers with its right. Above its head is the motto, "The Ghost of Criticism Past," and under the toad's feet a banner that reads, "Vote for Calvin Coolidge." A third effort in this direction was to a section called Wisdom of the Old, and these were all found quotations by older poets that seemed so ridiculous that he would just quote them verbatim and let them sit there on their own, and let each writer be hoist with his own petard as he went after Randall Jarrell and Alan Tate and Carl Shapiro. Maybe Carl Shapiro's, I should read Carl Shapiro's, sorry. I'm feeling a little self-conscious about garbling my words. A lot of you know, but some of you don't know that 6 months ago I had 2 major cerebrovascular accidents, and so I'm happy to be here and standing up, let alone mostly talking. So here is the quotation of Carl Shapiro. "We have many, many poets, all highly trained and expert in the skill of writing poetry. I'm not trying to be witty when I say that the average graduate student who works a little at it can write a poem as well as Yeats. My opinion of Yeats has suffered considerably from this discovery. Was Yeats a graduate student?" That's the end. So satire was one part of it. Parody was another. Of course, with parody, it helps to know the original and many parodic poems on the Dead Dog poem, the Foreign Statue poem, the Troy poem, the Public Lavatory poem, and so on one weekend, Bly and James Wright together wrote a poem called My Guggenheim to Italy under the name I Am Baroque, but I'm not going to read that one. Finally, a lot of you know who Charles Bukowski is, right?
Yeah.
And know something about him and what he's like. And a person submitted a parody of Charles Bukowski using the name Quarles Bobulski, and the name is the name of the poem. Forgive me, I'll just read one stanza. Is "Life is a handkerchief full of snot." Every day I sit around in this maggot-ridden room, drunk again, or maybe still on buck-a-gallon wine, just setting fire to the hairs on my chest with my 267th cigarette of the day, and putting them out again with my dirty bare hand, because life is a sad handkerchief full of snot, and I've got its number. I know everything about it. I already knew everything about it last year. I'm no goddamn good, haven't been for 45 years, and I've seen worse, a hell of a lot worse. It's actually quite typical of Bukowski himself.
Wow.
Anyway, this again was unheard of in a literary magazine. Nobody was doing this, and it was, it didn't show good Midwestern manners. That's for sure. But it was effective, and people, readers loved it, of course, and hung on to it and missed it when it wasn't there. Anyway, for a little bit, I'm going to go back into Bly's biography. A lot of you might know something about this too, but I would just very briefly talk about this. How is it that he came to be an editor? Well, it was by being born, of course, on December 23rd, 1926, in the little town of Madison, Minnesota, 10 miles from the South Dakota border. And living on a farm outside of town, he attended a one-room schoolhouse until high school, where he clearly excelled. When he left the one-room schoolhouses, he went to school in town. There were 20 people in his class, and he was just a country kid. He was a farm boy, and they were all townies, that sort of looked askance at him. But for an English class in high school, he assembled a poetry anthology, including poems of Longfellow, Poe, Stevenson, William Cullen Bryant, John Greenleaf Whittier, Walt Whitman, and Rudyard Kipling. And he organized them under 3 headings: liberty and patriotism, the door of death, and the better life. So he was an anthologist anyway in high school. So then he enlisted in the Navy in 1944, while his older brother joined their father in working the farm, and served in the Navy, and then was honorably discharged after the war ended. And in 1946, he entered St. Olaf College, which is where all good Norwegian Lutheran boys, kids with brains, entered in those days. And when he got there, he began writing immediately and got on staff of the newspaper, and was writing a weekly column. And his pieces were comical and slightly barbed. In one called Bligh Bridges Barrier but Bungles Blisho, that's B-L-I-S-H-O, he invents a new language as a solution to the problem that, quote, foreign languages are treacherously draining the strength of our nation's youth. Which is interesting for a future translator to be saying. Anyway, in 1947 he transferred, still on the GI Bill, transferred to Harvard, which changed everything. Though he was very much self-conscious as a country bumpkin who had gone to rural schools with all these prep school boys and so on, John Ashbery and Frank O'Hara and Kenneth Koch and Harold Brodkey and John Hawkes and at Radcliffe, Adrian Rich and Allison Lurie and Barbara Zimmerman Epstein, the future editor of the New York Review of Books. But somehow he, after a year there, he became literary editor of the Harvard Advocate, the most venerable college literary magazine in the country. And the title, the name for the literary editor was Pegasus, that horse again. And that is, there's a lot of interest there as well, because he began writing criticism there. He also had to accept poems and reject poems, and he contributed poems and short stories himself. In his senior year, he won the Big Poetry Award at Harvard for a poem called The Indian Trail, a poem referencing the U.S. Dakota War of 1862, and was appointed class poet to read an excerpt of his poem at commencement. After graduation, he returned to Minnesota, and the next year he spent solitary in the woods, first at a cabin up on Capicona Lake, and then on Lake Superior for most of the year, as he said, trying to write Miltonic sonnets up there and poaching food, that sort of thing. Then after a year doing that, he moved to New York City, living the Garrett life, moving from room to room, often escaping without catching up on his rent, as I found from reading his letters. And then after 2 years in New York, he returned to Cambridge and went up there and became involved in what was called the Poets Theater and was the assistant director for the first performance of American performance, I think, of Yeats's play, The Player Queen. It is a little, I'm full of trivia, but it's not very well known that I think that Robert Bligh wrote plays for decades, starting in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, up into the 90s. Some of them were performed, most of them went nowhere, but in any case, he was always interested in doing that. Then in 1954, he attended the Iowa Writers' Workshop, and in 56 and 57, he was a Fulbright scholar to Oslo. He went there with the idea of translating Norwegian poetry, learning Norwegian first, and so on. But it really changed his life because he got over there and he discovered poets that he really had no idea existed. Pablo Neruda, Georg Trakl, Juan Ramon Jimenez, Cesar Vallejo, Gunnar Eklöf, and others. All these were new to him. And this was earth-shaking for him as he discovered that there was this great poetry in other languages that was virtually unknown in the United States and that he had not gotten any of in college. So he wrote to his friend Donald Hall from Norway that year and said near the end, I am more and more convinced that our generation has a real destiny in the course of American poetry. But I think the destiny lies in an opposite direction to to where it has been living so far. Namely, it lies in revolution. If the writers of the 30s think we are too tame, let them watch. I will take them apart brick by brick. How could the time of advance and radicalism be over when the imagination has hardly touched the density of modern life? He declared that the quality of current poetry is quite low. Most of the poems simply lack kick, life. They simply are not convincing. Moreover, their timidity and technique is appalling. And he calls a steady decline in American poetry since the poets of the 1910s, Eliot, Pound, Williams, Marianne Moore, Robinson Jeffers, absolutely undeniable. So when he got home, then he engaged in more conversations with William Duffy, and they began to discuss putting a magazine together. As William Duffy was living in Clara City, midway between Madison and Minneapolis.
Well, I was in graduate school, and a friend of his said to me, I want you to meet Robert Bly. And this was 1955. So I went to meet him, and I said, where are you going now? He says, out to my farm.
Yeah.
I said, what are you going to do there?
Yeah.
I'm going to write poetry, he said. I said, how are you going to make a living? He says, I'm going to write poetry. And I said, you're insane.
And you were right, yeah.
And then these two poets came from New York. After a couple of issues, two poets came from New York to see what we were doing and wanted to talk to us. So they spent 2 or 3 days with us, and we were just finishing dinner one evening and talking about poetry. And I was sitting by the window, and I reached over. I saw a pistol by the window. So I reached over and I said to Robert, "Is this loaded?" He says, "I don't know." So I shot the pistol in the floor. Boom! It goes. And the two poets in New York says, "When is the next bus to Minneapolis?"
Yes, there's always more to the story.
Oh, yeah.
So, one of the most powerful things about the magazine was criticism. And when Donald Hall talks about when he first met Robert Bly at Harvard, he said, "I first knew him as a critic. He was writing poetry in secret." And it's this fundamental belief that harsh, honest, subjective, and constructive criticism was the only way for poets to learn, for poetry to thrive, to move forward. Poets and poetry did not benefit from anything less. And this, of course, meant a lot of disagreements between friends. And one of the things though he wrote many critical essays in his own name in each issue, or at least one per issue, he also then adopted this name Crunk in order to write a critical essay in each issue about one contemporary poetry, a young poet, somebody in their 30s, his own age. This, of course, was unheard of. Nobody was doing this. Nobody was taking poets of this age seriously. And he would write these essays under the pseudonym of Crunk and criticize them harshly, but also find something to praise, because he only picked at people that he respected somehow. And in most cases, the poet would write back later, even if they had never met, and say, you know, the criticism you leveled against me is something I've been thinking myself for a long time, or would take his direction, and that sort of thing. So in the first issue, it was Louis Simpson. In the second, Robert Creeley. In the third, Donald Hall. And the fourth, W.S. Merwin, who is a poet I'm sure many of you are familiar with. And these essays, the essay on Merwin, just a few little excerpts to give you again an idea of what I was just talking about. He would look at Merwin's earlier books and say, he quotes from his first book, A Mass for Janus, and Crunk says, these lines have no emotional meaning, no intellectual meaning, no political meaning, no religious meaning, no dramatic meaning, nothing. Then about a poem in his second book, The Dancing Bears, Crunk writes, this parade of nothingness is frightening and gives us a sense of emptiness like that of hell. But near the end, he gets more positive about Merwin's skills. And as Crunk would often end this saying, like we've been on a tour. So he announces, this must be the end of a short tour through Mr. Merwin's work. Behind his poetry, he presents a picture of a genuine, enduring, and graceful man, marred by a reluctance to be extreme. He lives on earth as though in a warm room, surrounded by a world of smiling objects, all of which he sleepily understands, as if he had known everything once and then forgotten it, like a great general born into the world again as a member of the animal kingdom. And so ends a critical essay. Others, and then maybe most famously, James Dickey. He and James Dickey had become great friends very fast. There were many similarities between them. But when Crunk took on James Dickey, his Bly's opinion had begun to change. So he started speaking negatively about Dickey's poetry, and he ends the tour by saying, when his imagination is interested, he carries tremendous physical energy into his poems. His courage is so great, he does not fill the poem with phony Greek heroes as disguises, but instead places himself in the front of the poem, under clear glass, where you can see him for bad or good and judge him as a fanatic, an animal killer, a lecher, a failure, or whatever you wish to. In his best poems, something subterranean and preconscious is always present. He is like a big moose, adapted somehow to living beneath the water in some calm island lake. The moose is constantly rising to the surface and breaking water so he can see his own huge horns in the sunlight, and giving a fixed and strange smile to the frightened bourgeoisie out fishing. As many of you also probably know, eventually an essay was published, and the headline said, "The Collapse of James Dickey." And this is the one in which he reviewed Dickey's book, Buck Dancer's Choice, that had won the National Book Award. Dickey was now the equivalent of the poet laureate, and he ripped this book to shreds, and ripped Dickey to shreds, and ended with a really ad hominem invective against Dickey. And I don't know if you want to hear it. It might be so too shocking, but in any event, his decline from a mountain tent in Drowning with Others, that's a book, to slave quarters, another poem, is catastrophic, enough to make you weep. One cannot help but feel that his depressing collapse represents some obscure defeat for the United States also. He began writing about 1950, writing honest criticism and sensitive poetry, and suddenly at the age of 43, we have a huge blubbery poet, pulling out Southern language in long strings like taffy, a toady to the government, supporting all movements toward empire, a sort of Georgia Cracker Kipling.
Whoa.
Yeah, that's right. Anyway, it's really Bly's critical essays that deserve the greatest attention, and as some of you know, there was one issue of the 70s magazine, and this is the one that really stands as the greatest of all the issues, in which he defines what is known as leaping poetry, and writes essentially 9 essays in this magazine himself, doing without any satire or parody whatsoever, but leaving a kind of permanent mark that it's something that's essentially is still in print too. Leaping poetry, and people are constantly referencing it. I feel like maybe I'm running out of time. Am I?
Yeah. Well, you want to move on to questions? You want to see if anyone?
And I'm happy to answer questions. Yeah. Yeah.
What grabbed you about Bly and Quinn in your life?
What and when? That's, I don't want to make this too long a story. I like to say when I went to college in 1970, I also went to St. Olaf College. I brought 5 books with me. One was a Bible to keep my parents happy. 3 were books about resisting the draft, because I was planning on that. And the 4th was a signed copy of Silence in the Snowy Fields that my father had given to me as a gift. And I really didn't know much about it. But then a couple of years ago, a roommate of mine who happens to be in the room said, "Oh, Robert Bly is reading. I want to go hear him. I want to say hi to him for my mother, who went to high school with him." So we went to a Robert Bly reading, and I think my curiosity then was really picked up. But surely it was his anti-war activism at the time that was key for me, that somebody could be a crazy poet and be vociferously opposing the war.
I'm just curious, what the economics, I mean, I know nobody got rich doing this. Were they able to actually pay some of the poets that contributed? And do they have a very large distribution of the magazine that's biggest poets?
They were able to
But
pay, of
repeat the
course.
question, Mark.
Oh, yeah, the economics of running the magazine and how they did it. Could they actually pay the poets and make a go of it?
We did. We paid the poets.
Right. Initially, a little bit, and my understanding is at the outset you each put $500 in, right,
That's right.
for the first issue and so on.
Yeah.
And the first issue had 1,000 copies, and then they started gathering, gaining subscriptions and so on. Of course, they gave away a lot of those early magazines, but the printing of the magazine went up and up to a high of 5,000 at one point.
Oh.
And of course they had the press as well, and were printing these books, which also my impression is they all sold quite well. So they were, I think, making money, not enough to survive, which is why Bly always went on reading tours. And when he got his first translation job, it was for a children's book called The Illustrated Guide to Reptiles and Amphibians of the World, translating it from Danish into English. And he wrote to Donald Hall, "I got $800, which is enough to keep us on the farm for 6 months." So it didn't take that much. Of course, he had been basically given the house by his father, and his expenses were low. But anyway.
So who is the audience? Who was the audience for the magazine?
The audience was intended to be only poets, and this is really why he became so influential, because poets of all kinds were reading it, and it's like they felt they had to read what Bly had to say, because other poets were really paying attention, whether they agreed with him or not. They knew what he was saying, and wanted to find things to disagree with. One of the things that Robert really loved and was very important, still is important to him, is to generate an argument, generate a discussion. That he felt that that was a sign that poetry was healthy, when people were discussing. So when he got criticism, he relished it, and sometimes when the first book of translation that he and James Wright did for the 60s press, called 20 Poems of Georg Trakl, this Austrian poetry from early 20th century. One review from a reviewer said, you know, this is a good idea, but wouldn't it behoove the poets to actually know a little bit of German? And then he listed 4 howlers in the German. And so this was a very short review. And so for the next advertisement for the book, Robert printed that entire review as the ad for the book. Because his point wasn't that they were German scholars or that they actually knew the language very well, but they were trying to translate the tone and the feeling of the poetry itself. So.
Mark, why don't you talk a little bit more about the fact that he did this in the middle of nowhere? I mean, the home of the beloved home of Bill Duffy for a while, but I mean on this flat plains of the center of the continent. Versus the ferment was in Paris, it was in New York, it was suddenly in San Francisco. Why didn't he go to one of those places and stay? I mean, it still amazes me.
Yeah, well, I think my saying it was like a haven for him, that he really, he liked not having any literary friends to talk to much of the time, that it was part of the key being solitude, that he could educate himself, and then occasionally, you know, in the early years, he and Carol would go to New York in the wintertime for up to 6 months. And so that was a time when he got to know a lot of other poets in New York, and then they'd move back to Madison to their farmhouse in the summer months. And of course, the magazine was not produced out in western Minnesota. For much of its life, it was printed in Ireland. It was the cheapest way to do it, and then be shipped to New York. And he and Bill Duffy, I know, went once with Robert to the docks in New York to pick up issues of the magazine that had arrived from Ireland. Yeah.
And there was an Irishman on the dock. And so Robert said, you talk to him and tell him who you are. So he said, no, actually it ended up, he liked talking to us, and he said, there's no fees. You can have the books without any fees.
Oh, wow.
It's amazing.
The one thing I'm sorry I didn't get to talk about because I went on too long about other things is his involvement in anti-war activism and how he began all that, and it's extraordinarily impressive. He was just heading out to on the poetry circuit to the northwest and ran into David Ray at Reed College, and they decided in 3 days to form a new organization called Poets and Writers Against the Vietnam War. And so they called poets and then began this process, and then almost immediately in the next couple of months, produced a little anthology themselves of writings, not just poems, but also writings by Thucydides and Hermann Goering and Hitler and newspaper articles and so on. And then barnstormed the country, going to college and university after that. And then he began very openly turning down money from the government. He was given a grant of $5,000, which is an awful lot of money in those days, and he really needed it. But he refused to accept it because he said, it's just a matter of bookkeeping that separates this money from the money to buy napalm and that sort of thing. And then in the early 1967, there was an Angry Arts Week, Angry Arts Against the War in Vietnam in New York, and these were artists of all kinds, a week-long thing. And he emceed the poetry reading, but then he himself gave what was called this napalm poetry reading, and had slideshows and a chalk talk and all this data from government information about weaponry to talk about the harm that was being done to people in their name with the horrible death caused by napalm and so on. The pinnacle of all this when he accepted the National Book Award in 1968 for The Light Around the Body. He went to Lincoln Center. The people who were there, Thornton Wilder for The Eighth Day, George Kennan, his memoirs, Howard and Edna Hong from St. Olaf for their translations of Kierkegaard, and Jonathan Kozol, his book, Death at a Young Age, or whatever that's called. And Bly got up there and accepted the war, and he immediately, do I dare just take a minute? You're all captive. He started his acceptance speech by saying, I am uneasy at a ceremony emphasizing our current high state of culture. Cultural events traditionally put writers to sleep, and even the public, but we don't want to be asleep anymore. Something has happened to me lately. Every time I have glanced at a bookcase in the last few weeks, the books on killing of the Indians leap out into my hand. Reading a speech of Andrew Jackson's on the Indian question the other day, his second annual message, I realized he was the Westmoreland of 1830. His speech was like an administration speech today. It was another speech recommending murder of a race as a prudent policy requiring stamina. Perhaps this coincidence should not have surprised me, but it did. And then he says, as Americans, we have always wanted the life of feeling without the life of suffering. We long for pure light, constant victory. We have always wanted to avoid suffering, and therefore we are unable to live in the present. But our hopes for a life of pure light are breaking up. Isn't the next step for the institutions to take similar acts? He's just talked about William Sloane Coffin, Daniel Berrigan, and so on. What has the book industry done to end the war? Nothing. What have our universities done to end the war? Nothing. What have our museums like the Metropolitan done? Nothing. What has my own publisher, Harper & Row, done to help end the war? Nothing. In an age of gross and savage crimes by legal governments, the institutions will have to learn responsibility, learn to take their part in preserving the nation, and take their risk by committing acts of disobedience. And then he had been handed a check for $1,000, and then called a young man up to the stage and said to him, I hereby counsel you as a young man not to enter the United States Army now under any circumstances. And I ask you to use this money I am giving you to find and counsel other young men to defy the draft authorities and not destroy their spiritual lives by participating in this war. Bly's action was illegal and carried a possible penalty of 5 years in prison and or a $10,000 fine. There was cheering and also some booing, people standing and people sitting on their hands. And so this was a sort of an exemplary kind of culmination too of the work his magazine had been doing all along. For years he had been talking about the need for poets not only going deep into their unconscious to also engage with the consciousness of the nation itself, where it was, and to get involved with current goings on.